A calm, cool, and collected liberal commentator recently appeared on a Newsmax panel, and he successfully triggered the two hosts and his fellow guest by successfully defending President Biden's record and attacking Donald Trump's laziness. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have 3 clips, I think, to look at in this video. And the protagonist in 2 of them is a guy by the name of Grant Stearns. He's the gentleman on the far left with the beard. He is the executive editor of Occupy Democrats, and he's apparently a frequent foil on these Newsmax shows, these Newsmax panels. He's like the token liberal that they will occasionally allow on to refute some of their more ridiculous claims. He's pretty good at it. Got a couple of clips to show you, but this one here, it's a very short clip, but he defends President Biden's record and mocks Donald Trump, and he does it in a way which triggers the other 3 people on screen, not just the guest who is presumably defending Trump and attacking Biden, but the 2 Newsmax hosts, and it's pretty funny.
I wrote a biography about Joe Biden. Throughout his career, Joe Biden made these kind of verbal gaffes, and he's not perfect. He's going to make some verbal gaffes, but he knows what he's doing when it comes to governing the country. That's why unemployment has been historically low. That's why the stock market has been historically high at the same time, and inflation ground to 0 last month.
Can you explain why
the last?
I wrote a
So you see how they can't wrestle with the facts at all? Like, they don't want to attack Biden's record. They have nothing to refute. Right? So when he talks about how unemployment has been historically low under President Biden, and indeed it was like 27 months, a stretch we have not seen in like 50 or 60 years, where the unemployment level was under 4%. And the stock market has been repeatedly recording record high after record high. Instead, they go to memes, they go to gaffes, they go to questions about rhetoric and communicative style, because they don't want to deal with the substance. Now, again, if you want to attack President Biden based on his gaffes, based on his verbal blunders, that's fine. It's perfectly fair, because communication is a valid part of the president's duties. But at the end of the day, as we've talked about in time and time again, the true purpose of the president of the United States is to be the chief executive, to be the head of state, to be the head of government. And executive management and administrative skills are just as, if not more important. But they don't want to contend with the record. Instead, they want to go to, he can't read cue cards. But as we've also talked about in other videos, Donald Trump, when he was president, repeatedly made use of cue cards, repeatedly made use of note cards in the aftermath of a mass shooting. When Trump met with the parents and next of kin of the victims of that mass shooting, he was famously caught having a note card which says, "Show compassion." He had to write down, because he's such a malignant narcissist and sociopath, "show compassion," and read it to himself before meeting with these people. Okay, that is how cognitively deficient Donald Trump is, to say nothing of the other examples that we've talked about time and time again. But I do want to remind you, I just want to show some things here. This was recently reported on Fox News about the stock market, yet again under President Biden, reporting record highs.
Wow, a huge market day for the bulls. The dance party continues for them. Fireworks here with the Dow Jones Industrials up 434. S&P and NASDAQ at records. We'll see you tomorrow.
Of course, they do everything in their power to avoid giving President Biden credit for it, which would be fine if they didn't have a different standard for Republican presidents. Of course, people wanted to take the position that, listen, the president's very important, but they have little direct day-to-day influence on the economy. That's perfectly fair. The problem is that Newsmax and the Fox Propaganda Network, as well as Republicans in general, love to give Republican presidents for economic successes that they inherit, by the way, usually from Democratic presidents, and then don't give Democratic presidents any credit for those economic successes. And then when there are economic disasters under Republican presidents, as we saw in the last year of President Bush's administration, the last year of Donald Trump's administration, they just want to conveniently ignore that. Okay, so again, the standard is truly hypocritical and twisted by these very same people who don't want to give Biden credit at all, and instead appeal to gaffes, misspeaks, things like that. And then even on that score, Trump has his own that they don't want to contend with. You see, just it's a minefield that they try to put in front of people like Grant Stern. And I've got another clip I want to play of Stern. But before I do that, this was also dropped on MSNBC recently, and I thought it was really good. MSNBC financial analyst Steve Ratner basically dedicated 3 minutes to debunking the lie, the persistent lie. I couldn't even call it a myth. It's a lie. It's a calculated lie by right-wingers and by Trump that Trump presided over an amazing economy that he built himself and that his economy was somehow better than President Biden. So just to really drive this home, I want to play this clip, and then we'll move on to the other one by Grant Stern.
Yeah, well, look, this election is obviously going to be fought on the economy like many elections. And Donald Trump has argued that President Biden has delivered the worst economy in history. So let's look at a few metrics that might suggest the facts are actually something different. And you mentioned job growth. We can start with job growth. So this is job growth across presidents going back to Reagan. But let's focus for the moment on Trump versus Biden. And let's be fair and strip out the effects of COVID, which obviously hurt Donald Trump and ultimately helped Joe Biden during the recovery. So that's these darker bars. And you can see, even stripping out COVID, Donald Trump created an average of 182,000 jobs a month. Joe Biden created an average of 268,000 jobs a month. And that is not only more than Donald Trump, that is more than any president going back to somewhere before Reagan. We go back.
So I want to pause there. We're going to play more of this clip, but I just want to say, because, of course, some people would say, oh, this is MSNBC. Well, number one, Steve Ratner is an extremely respected financial analyst. He is bringing the receipts. People are welcome to quibble with it. And I would point out that he is actually being more generous to Donald Trump and to MAGA Republicans than Trump and MAGA Republicans deserve. This idea that we won't count COVID. As I've said time and time again, I refuse to grant the premise. If a Republican comes up to me and says, Josiah, you can't possibly hold COVID against Trump or give Biden credit for COVID. Well, number one, I disagree because, again, if the shoe was on the other foot, and we just know this, given the persistent bad faith in which MAGA Republicans operate, they would never grant that concession. If you took Joe Biden and Donald Trump and switched roles in the timeline, and it had been Joe Biden presiding over the first year of COVID in 2020, you would not have MAGA Republicans today saying, you know what, we got to grade Biden on a curve. It wasn't his fault what happened during COVID. They would say, no, he was the president, happened on his watch. He had a duty to take care of it. That's a fair standard to have. I don't blame Trump for COVID in the sense that it wasn't his fault that COVID existed. But as chief executive, Donald Trump had a responsibility, a moral, ethical, civic, constitutional responsibility to protect the country against COVID to the best of his ability, And as I've mentioned before, Trump had an obligation to use the bully pulpit of the presidency to rally the American people, to rally Republicans, Republican voters, Republican politicians, Republican governors, people in his party, in his cult, who would listen to him and say, guys, we have to take this seriously. We have to unite as a country. We have to defeat COVID. We have to do everything in our power to save ourselves, our loved ones, our neighbors, and everyone else. He didn't do that. He didn't defer to his medical advisors, people like Fauci, Redford, Birx. He constantly undercut and undermined them. And by the way, this was at a time when Democrats were willing to work with Trump, even though it was an election year, and even though they hated Trump, and even though they tried to impeach Trump before in 2019, early 2020, over the perfect Ukraine phone call, which was perfectly valid, by the way, that impeachment. But they were still willing to set that aside, and the proof is in the pudding. Democrats helped Trump deliver two major pieces of COVID stimulus, bipartisan, the HEROES and CARES Act, during an election year when they knew that Trump would get the credit for it. So Democrats, for all their faults, were just objectively willing to set partisan politics and electoral politics aside to help Trump. So Trump had allies in the Democratic Party who were eager for him to take this seriously and for him to manage the pandemic well, even if he would get credit for it. It was Trump and the Republicans' fault for not taking COVID as seriously as they should have. President Biden came into office, inherited this mess, presided over the vaccine rollout, did everything in his power to get people vaccinated so the economy could open back up safely. And his passage of the American Rescue Plan, which was on a partisan basis, no Republican voted for it, created 4 million jobs, avoided a double-digit recession, and put money back in the pockets of Americans. So yes, I think it's perfectly fair to blame Donald Trump for the pandemic because he didn't do his best, and to give President Biden credit for the economic recovery. But even if you don't do that, Ratner still says, as we've talked about before, President Biden has created more jobs per month, by far, than Donald Trump did, even if you control for COVID either way. Now we'll play the rest of the clip.
Back to Reagan here. So even Clinton, even Reagan, Joe Biden created ex-COVID more jobs. The president's been talking a lot about manufacturing jobs. So let's look at the record on manufacturing jobs. It is true manufacturing jobs began to come back under Trump. Not surprisingly, they fell off a cliff. And Joe Biden has brought them back to the highest level they've been at since during the financial crisis. We have 186,000 more manufacturing jobs than we had in 2008. Obviously, we'd like to have still more, but manufacturing is a very tough sector for us. And this is a pretty impressive performance.
So job growth better under Joe Biden objectively. Let's move over to your next chart, which is the growth of GDP and wages, how much money people are making. How do those two stack up there?
Sure. Well, GDP is obviously the holy grail of any economy. The faster you grow, the better off people will be, sometimes with a bit of a lag, this and that, but they'll be better off. So again, let's be fair and let's strip out COVID from these results and take a look at what we see. So under Trump, GDP growth averaged 2.6% annual rate during his presidency, not including COVID, as I said. Joe Biden averaged 3.6% during his presidency, 1% on an economy that is well over $20 trillion is an enormous difference in terms of the amount of economic activity, extra economic activity that you.
So again, just really to drive this home, of all the major macroeconomic metrics, GDP is the most comprehensive, probably the most important. And there, Biden still crushes Trump, even if you control for COVID. And that's why the United States has objectively the best economy in the world and has had the best economy in the world since President Biden took over.
You're creating. And so this one isn't even close. Look, we all have to acknowledge that inflation has been tough. There's no doubt that we went from a very benign inflation environment to a considerably, that's the green line, to a considerably higher inflationary environment. Some of that was driven by supply problems. When you had supply chain problems, shortages, prices tended to go up. A lot of it was driven by the Federal Reserve and not addressing that quickly enough with interest rates. And yes, some of that is on the Biden administration with the American Rescue Plan, which most people in retrospect thought was too much. But look what's been happening in the last year. Probably people don't realize this. First of all, inflation has come way down, and it is very close, as Jerome Powell suggested in his testimony yesterday. It's getting very close to where the Fed could cut interest rates as soon as September. And secondly, for more than a year, wage growth has been higher than inflation. In other words, the wage growth, the black line, higher than the green line. And so we are making up ground, and it is moving in the right direction.
Hey there, MSNBC fans.
So there you have it, folks. Again, that's a fair analysis where Steve Ratner doesn't pull punches. He says you can blame some of inflation on President Biden's American Rescue Plan, as well as the two major pieces of COVID stimulus, I might add, that was passed bipartisanly by Trump, by Republicans, and by Democrats in the last year of the Trump administration. So it's not like things are perfect. It's not like we don't have progress to make up for or progress to continue, but simply on most major macroeconomic metrics, President Biden has just done a better job managing this economy, and his economy is just better than Trump's. Last clip I want to play of Grant Stern here. He takes a shot at former President Trump's laziness, because, of course, that's something else you hear from right-wing media, that Biden is somehow lazy or hands-off in terms of his administration. Absolutely ridiculous. And Grant Stern kind of flips the script on them with respect to Trump.
Trump kind of turned his entire presidency into the golf presidency, and mostly to benefit his own properties, some of which were ill-gotten and caused him to lose a $500 million civil judgment for fraud. So, I mean, I don't know what Joe Biden would really learn about Donald Trump out there on the golf course for 3 hours, but certainly Donald Trump spent most of his presidency preparing to play more golf.
Well, we could answer.
So, of course, this is in response to Trump yet again challenging President Biden to a golf match, because that's the only thing Trump seems to care about in this world besides avoiding jail time is whether or not he's good at golf. I assume he cares more about that than his own children. And so Grant Stern's making the case, well, listen, I don't know what Trump would have to teach Biden there. Maybe he's a better golfer, maybe he's not, but it would make sense that he is a better golfer given the enormous amount of time that Trump spent golfing when he was president of the United States. And also, making a point to mention the amount of tax dollars that went to Trump properties effectively by the American people, the billing Secret Service for extended stays at Trump Towers, Trump hotels, et cetera, and so forth. But the point is this notion that Donald Trump was some sort of vigorous executive actually isn't supported by the facts. He did spend a considerable amount of time, yes, nearly a year, according to reports, golfing or at resorts golfing. And that might explain why so many of Trump's former officials refer to him as an idiot. People who actually worked for him, who did the day-to-day work, say that he's uncurious, he's stupid. Rex Tillerson, Trump's Secretary of State, his first Secretary of State, referred to Trump as an effing moron. stuff like this might be the reason why. And so at the end of the day, I like the fact that certain liberals are allowed onto these right-wing networks to trigger them, to bring the facts, to, basically pour cold water onto the smoldering embers of their Trump derangement syndrome. Because, of course, as you know, MAGA is the one truly with the Trump derangement syndrome, because it's a cult. And I think Grant Stearns does a really good job of dousing those cultish aspirations. Let me know what you think in the comments.